Thank you very much. Why taxa and scandal? Taxa because you're nerds, I've got to do some science, and scandal because you're punters, the great unwashed, and things like scandal interest you, you know. Do you want, or would you rather I talked about Firewood merchant associations and the rise of trade unionism in the beginning of the 20th century? No? Okay. No, I'm going to talk about scandal because it's a good topic. All right, briefly introduce myself, by the way. I'm an archaeologist. I've also worked as a bicycle courier and lectured in medicine. I'm doing private research into a history of firewood from the 1830s to the 1950s in Victoria, looking not just at taxa, which I was very interested in, what wood is good to burn, but also looking at things like unions, merchant associations, and people, biography. So this is a story. First of all, here comes the science, people. It's only from the 1840s to the 1900s, but this is a graph of the different firewoods that were most mentioned in Trove Historic newspaper comments. Focus on the purple, for those who are colourblind, she oaks. In the early period of Melbourne's history, what was the best firewood? She oaks. What do I want to buy? She oak. What happened to the she oaks? They cut them down. You'll notice a bit of a lump here. This lump here is actually further out in Victoria, that way, where they hadn't cut them down yet until they settled there, and then they cut them down. And this is why this is science. This is because I believe that in environmental reconstructions of past vegetation of Australia before Europeans invaded Victoria, I think she oaks are underestimated. So there we go. That's your science for you. Let's move on to scandal. Victoria Coffee Palace. It's a dining room. You see nice, gentle people. What's a coffee palace? It's a hotel with no alcohol. It's a temperance hotel. So in 1885, a man called Thomas Rettelick, about 40 years old, tall, sturdily built, Cornish, comes from Cornwall. He emigrated from England, arrived in England and went straight away to stay at a temperance palace. Why? Because he was a devout Methodist. He's in the temperance Victoria Coffee Palace and he goes down to the lounge and he's horrified to see men playing cards on the Sabbath. He's not so sure about this anymore. But another man walks in, is invited to play cards and refuses because it's the Sabbath. He thinks, oh, there's a fella worth knowing. So he starts talking to this fella. It turns out that Thomas Rettelick is from Bodmin in Cornwall, and the man he was talking to, Charles Augustus Smythe, was from Peasenhall in Suffolk. Why does that matter? People in Suffolk speak Southern English. It's pretty much a civilised, nice form of English. It's not Northern and it's not Cornish. In 1885, where I'm talking about, there were still people alive who spoke Cornish as their first language. Cornish is a Celtic language, closely related to Welsh, more distantly related to Irish and Scottish and Breton. So he starts talking to this fella and, among other things, he wants to share his tale of woe because while the ship, the Liguria, was coming out from England, not only did it pick up people, by the way, from the New South Wales contingent who had been on sick leave, they'd been in Sudan on military adventurism. It'll come up again, so that's why I mention it. But while they were in the sewers, in the Red Sea, the heat in the Red Sea was most excessive and trying. and occasioned the death of 3 of the passengers, including Frank H. Rettelick, a child who was a passenger, by the way, in the 2nd class for Melbourne. This was Thomas Rettelick's child, one of his 3 children. So he's telling this man that, yes, it's been a rough little while, but by the way, I've come from Cornwall. My father died. I sold his farm. I got his life insurance. I sold my farm. And I've got £5,040 as a nest egg that I want advice on which bank should I put it in, which of the banks is safe. And perhaps, we can talk about, I want to buy a farm, but I'm, going to take my time and so on. £5,040 means nothing to you, does it? At one stage, he's working in a quarry for 8 shillings a day. At 8 shillings a day, £5,040 is more than 40 years' worth of wages. It's a nice bit of money. So he starts talking to this man, Charles Augustus Smythe, well-spoken, again in his 40s as well, dark complexion, handlebar moustache and sideburns, charismatic, a lay preacher since he was 18 years old, preaching Wesleyan Methodism. Charles Augustus Smythe invites Thomas and his family to come and stay with him at the house that he's renting until his family comes down from Sydney. And where are they renting? It's somewhere in Park Street West. So along Park Street there, looking out across the ovals, now ovals, but then Royal Park. If you're wondering where we are, we're there. Yeah, Howler. Okay, good. So Charles Augustus Smythe is a lovely man and they become close friends. Thomas Rettelick describes him as a beautiful man, somebody who he loves. Very emotional language. He confides in him, though. He confides that the woman he came out with, the woman who he introduces as Mrs. Rettelick, the mother of one of his children, in fact, is in fact not his wife. He left his 3rd wife in Cornwall. You see, he had contracted an intimacy with a servant, with one of his servants. Yeah, contracted an intimacy. They've got a child. Yeah, that's intimate. But his wife in Cornwall is looked after. He's left her a lot of money. And as it were, he's come out to England, and I presume come out to Australia. One of the reasons he's come out to Australia is so that his Sarah becomes Mrs. Rettelick. Because when you're in Melbourne, who's to say she's not Mrs. Rettelick? Yeah, this is Mrs. Rettelick. You going to argue with me? No, this is Mrs. Rettelick. These are our children. It legitimises the relationship. He lends Charles Augustus Smythe large amounts of money, including to buy a wood allotment at what was then South Brunswick Station, now Jewel. The wood allotments were along here. In other words, people, they were across the railway over there, running along where the car park at RMIT is. All up, he lends Charles Augustus Smythe £3,700. He's a good man. He's a holy man. He preaches in churches and at homes. This is the time when you would go to a church or you would go to somebody's home and listen to somebody preach, and that was a good day's afternoon or a good day's entertainment. What do we got next? Woodyard. Woodyard, wood, train, unloading wood. Wood. Here's another scene of a woodyard. You can see this is the raw stuff that comes in. Woodyards tend to break it down into 2-foot long things, and young children are at risk of getting hurt by the machinery and axes. While he's at Park Street, and then Mrs. Smythe comes with her 4 children. Mrs. Smythe, Charles Augustus Smythe's wife, comes with her 4 children, and he moves out. He moves to Gordon Park. I mentioned the Sudan War. This, of course, is Gordon of Khartoum, who got killed while he was trying to kill Sudanian people, military adventurers and so on. I mentioned the New South Wales contingent was there. Yes, Australia didn't go to war, first of all, in Gallipoli, invading the Ottoman Empire because the Ottoman Empire had been rude to the Russian Empire and the Russian Empire was the British Empire's friend. No. Australia's first experience of war was sending New South Wales soldiers to the Sudan, where several of them died, but they didn't actually engage in any conflict. This is Gordon Park, Reynard Street, Gordon Street, Bruce Street, Bell Street's up there, train station there. But after a while, jumping ahead, after a while, OK, I've lent you this £3,700 in dribs and drabs and so on, and you've said, oh yeah, it's coming back, it's coming back. Look, there's a mortgage in Sydney, it's coming back. I can't give you the price details, but it's coming back. But hang on, Charles Augustus Smythe, he keeps buggering off. He keeps going to, I don't know, Sydney. He's threatening to go to New Zealand. Where's the money? So eventually, also, by the way, he's asked other people. £500 of the money was for something to do with the railways and the woodyard. So he speaks to the other woodyard people and says, you know, railways, woodyard, £500. And they go, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? You know, there's nothing like that. There's no charge for £500. So he decides to take his good friend, and he still regarded him as a friend, to court. And one of the things you'll notice is that Charles Augustus Smythe is taken to court where he is represented by a QC. He's a gentleman. Gentlemen get represented by Queen's Counsels, very senior barrister, now called Senior Counsel or King's Counsel because we're the King. Mr. Crisp represents Retallick. OK, first court case. In this first court case, basically, Thomas Retallick speaks. It's unusual, but he is called to give evidence first. He speaks. He's a Cornish man. His dialect is thick. Not only is dialect thick, he uses strange terms like, I love Charles Augustus Smith. That's not the usual way that men talked about each other. But he's from Cornwall, they're weird, they do that sort of thing. People would come to the courtroom to listen to him speak because it was so amusing to hear this thick accent and this weird phrases. Barristers, when they had nothing else to do in other courts, would come and sit in and listen. They also called a Miss Dainty. Miss Dainty, come in the court. Mr. Retallick, do you recognise this woman? Was she introduced to you as the wife of Charles Augustus Smythe? No, never seen her before. OK, fine. Bye-bye, Miss Dainty, you can leave now. What's going on there? Well, it turns out that about 6 months before, using the name of Charles A. Williams, married Flora Ann Dainty in South Melbourne. So this man is not only now going to be accused of fraud, but he's done bigamy, and bigamy under a false name, it appears. What have we got next? Oh, Thing about Thomas Rettelick is that, yeah, he sounds as thick as pig shit. He's Cornish, he's a farmer, he's a yokel, but he has a great recollection for detail, and he is able to go through all this stuff that happened with Charles Augustus Smythe, so that Charles Augustus Smythe gets up and he basically goes, none of it's true, it was him who took the money, and no, I don't know any Ms. Dainty, and I don't know this, and I'd refer to my records, but he's taken them, and I don't know property, no, I don't know anything about that. Tell us about the Sydney mortgage, I don't know anything about, I can't give you the details, etc., etc. No, fuck you. You're guilty. Sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. He's also charged in a very little while with bigamy. But is this good for Thomas Rettelick? No. A charge. Yes, he's found guilty of fraud. Fantastic. The state has found him guilty of fraud. Where's the money? How do you get the money? You first of all go to the insolvency court. No, first of all you sue him for the money. And he goes, I ain't got no money. So he then goes to the insolvency court and he's found to be bankrupt. Except Charles Augustus Smythe, little lizard that he is, he does something very unusual. He's declared bankrupt, and usually you fill in a schedule. You fill in a schedule. Here's my debts, here's my assets. I have money, I have property, etc., etc. Here are my debts. These are the people I owe money to. Fine, we'll work it out, we'll sort through it, and so on. Except he refuses to fill in a schedule. And so he not only goes to the insolvency court, dark-complexioned, yes, I won't go there, I'll go back to this insolvency court bit. He's not only found to be bankrupt, but he is in contempt of court for not handing in a schedule. So he's been done for fraud, he's been done for bigamy, he's now being held for contempt of court in Pentridge, up there. And what's more, the New Zealand Methodists have now written to Melbourne, people, Wesleyan Methodists in Melbourne, and said, that Charles Augustus Smythe, yeah, we know him, came to New Zealand about 1881. In about 1883, he obtained money using what appeared to be forged references and bought into a haberdashery business. The haberdashery business started having a cash flow crisis. Then the haberdashery business's office and the financial records were burnt in a case of arson. Then he was declared bankrupt, and so was his partner in the haberdashery business, who was hoping that he'd get him out of the mess. He then debunks to Sydney with his wife and 4 children. So, okay, so far we've got fraud, arson, fraud, bigamy and contempt of court. Lovely man. So he's in Pentridge until, this is 1887, he's in Pentridge until 1891, by which time, being a gentleman and also being very good with accounts, he's now in charge of bookkeeping for Pentridge Prison. And they're actually not wanting to let it, they're saying, it's a pity he's going to go. But he finally admits, he finally says, no, I'm going to fill in a schedule. So he fills in a schedule. He says, this is what happened to the money that Rettelick lent me. Among other things, I was spending about, £400 a week on living expenses. This is 8 shillings a day, times 5, 40 shillings a week, that's about £2. So, £2 to keep your family, he's spending 400. What are you talking about? This is a load of shit. Your schedule is just unreal. Says the lawyers, but he's handed in a schedule. So he gets out of prison. He's done his time for the fraud and the bigamy. He gets out of prison. And he's never seen again. Says there, this is from the Victoria Police Gazette. We've looked for him. He's like this. We've looked at his Sydney address. We've looked at the address of the woman he married in South Melbourne. He may have gone to Adelaide with a view of clearing away from Australia. I suspect actually he went to the US, but I've got to confirm that it's a loose thread. Anyway, he buggers off. Does Thomas get any of his money back? No. Where did the money go? This bugger's probably taken it with him. But Thomas, meanwhile, has moved to Warragul. Is anybody here from Warragul or Druin? No? Nobody's here from Warragul. Pity, because I don't know it very well. He'd moved to Warragul. He lived on the main street for a little short while, a couple of months, and then he bought a farm over here on Number 1 Road. About 1897, he's there. No, I lie, even earlier, 1891. He's moved there, he's running a farm. His eldest son, William, is actually working for the government printing service and living in Coburg, Victoria Street, Coburg. But his youngest son, Frank, whose real name is George Hendry, but he calls him Frank Retlick after his dad, the one who died. So in other words, he was a George, but then we changed it to a Frank. They're living at Number 1 Road with his housekeeper. He has a housekeeper called Mrs. Hendry. Yeah, the Sarah Hendry who he bought out from England. But unfortunately, in 1902, he shoots himself in the head. Why a couple of prize cows died is one of the explanations, but I suspect the fact that he's been ripped off after being somebody who was trusting and righteous and so on. He's been ripped off, he's depressed, he commits suicide. However, he leaves $160, £760, I beg your pardon, to Mrs. Jane Retlick, his wife, in Cornwall. He leaves Sarah Hendry £150, and he leaves money too. He leaves a farm to his youngest son. This writing, this handwriting, in witness whereof I, the said Thomas Retlick, etc., there's his signature. That's the closest I can show you to what he looked like. That's his signature. So I thought I'd include it. Farm gets sold, 1.5 miles, what's that, couple of kilometres from Warragul Centre. And some 1932, Sarah Hendry passes away in Footscray. So Mrs. Hendry, Sarah Hendry, the wife, the woman who he contracted an intimacy and so on, left. Okay, I think that's the end of my slides. That's thank you for listening to that story. But the thing about this story, yeah, I should have added, thank you for listening to this story. The thing about this story is that it's not just about a scandal. Some people, bad man, Charles Augustus Smythe. We know he's bad because he, among other things, he marries people under a false name. He's a dirty rotter. He steals from his best friends. He burns things down. Thomas Retlick tried to do good. He was in a situation where he's with his wife, and then he is having an affair with another person, another woman, who gets pregnant with his child. How does he resolve this? By going to the other side of the world where they can live as Mr. and Mrs. Retlick. She can be legitimated. But Thomas is also, it's perplexing because from a religious perspective, we've got one man who's a charismatic lay preacher, really good. People invite him to his house for their little soirees to preach. But he's an arsehole. Thomas Retlick, naive, but also religiously devout, but hang on, contracted an intimacy and commits suicide. So from a religious perspective, what's going on here? How does this fall within the concepts of these religions? Are these good people, bad people? Can you do good and do bad, but you're good, etc., etc.? Gender perspective. You'll notice the women in this story get married, have children, and look after houses. That's not particularly, as an academic, I'll tell you, no, that's not very new, surprising. You know, I'm not going to get a whole paper out of that, that's for sure. From the religious aspect, hang on, look at this, what's happening with this religion and so on. But there's also, from my personal perspective, Firewood studies, one of the things Thomas Redlich says to his good friend Charles Augustus Smythe when he buys a woodyard is, what do you mean you bought a woodyard? You're a gentleman. Gentlemen don't own woodyards. And lo and behold, when I look at all the other people in my history who have owned woodyards, yes, gentlemen don't own woodyards. So this case of this titillating scandal also reveals things about marriage, gender politics. It reveals things about how religion is viewed, etc., etc. And so that's where I'm coming from it. And that's the end of me. Thank you for listening.
What an interesting story. And so much scandal in Brunswick. Crazy. I feel like they need to make a Netflix special out of it. Mr. Smythe versus Mr. Redlich. Yes. I feel like there's some money in that. Does anyone have any questions? We'll get some house lights, Steph.
Oh.
Yep.
How long have you spent researching all of this?
How long have you researched this for,
Too
Nick?
long. Occupational therapy. I've been looking at firewood for a long time. As I said, I'm an archaeologist. I've actually been looking at, my specialty is charcoal, looking at the skeleton, the burnt skeleton of wood, identifying it to taxa from predominantly Aboriginal sites, both post-European invasion and pre-European invasion. I've looked at charcoal from other places in the world, but it's mostly been from Australia. But Charles Redlich and Smythe, yeah, it hit a button with me, and I thought, oh yes, this is a nice bit of biography. This is some of the flesh. You know, we can talk about the industry and how the prices go up and down, and how the taxa change, and about the merchant associations and the trade unions, which only took 13 attempts to form. We can talk about all that. I can talk about women in firewood. There were women cutting firewood in the bush, carting it from the bush to the town and selling it. There were women, particularly there were a lot of women who owned wood yards, so usually because their husband was dead or otherwise indisposed, bankrupt, in prison, etc., etc. I could talk about Italians. Anybody here of claim Italian dispute? Seriously, the Italians are overrepresented in the firewood industry of Victoria. Unlike there have been, at the same time there were Greeks, there were Germans, there were Dutch, there were Chinese, there were Aboriginal people, there were all sorts of people, Indian people, Pashtuns and so on. But for some reason the Italians get into firewood.
Feels like there's another nerd night talk in Italians in firewood, to be honest. Do we have another question? Yep.
This is obviously quite a niche in the
1885, 1891, 1902, Thomas dies.
How did you come about this story?
Nick, how did you find the drama?
Trove. Trove is a National Library of Australia site, and it has historic newspapers of Australia. So you want to know the history of your family, particularly if you have an uncommon name. I'm sorry, if you have the name Smith, you're in trouble looking at the records. But if you can look up, if you have history in Australia, you can look up your parents' naturalisation certificates, for instance, which are published in Trove up until the 1970s or 80s. You can look up the address of your house and who lived there and who was murdered there and so on and so on. It's a wonderful resource. You can also look up words. So when did German cockroaches come to Australia? Well, about 1900s, they're first appearing and big in the 30s and then big in the 80s and et cetera, et cetera. I looked it up yesterday. Yeah.
That's all very interesting. If there's one very quick question and one very quick answer, we can take one more.
Oh.
If not, all right, one burning question. Go. What's the next scandal, Nick? Very quickly.
Oh, the next scandal. Oh, shit. How long does it take me to write something?
Oh, that sounds scandalous to me. All right, join me in thanking Nick, everyone.